Welcome to the second episode in the new series of LRB podcasts on fiction and the fantastic. I'm Marina Warner, and I've written often for the LRB, as well as books that explore myths, fairy tales, and the literature of wonder and astonishment. It's my absolute pleasure to be in conversation with the writer and scholar Della Subin, also a regular contributor to the paper, and the author of Accidental Gods, on men unwittingly turned divine, a remarkable study of the fantastic in action. In the last episode, we explored 1001 Nights, and we are now turning to another work of astonishing inventiveness, Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, which was published in 1726 and met with huge popular success and controversy from that moment till now. Strange unknowns are presented as fact, and its heroes a living witness to different kingdoms and nations, from Lilliput to the land of the Houyhnhnms and the Yahoos. The book presents many hypotheses about possible social organization, utopian and other, with an unprecedented boldness and frankness, some scabrous humor, and bitter, raging indignation. The fantastic gave Swift a laboratory, where as a writer he was free to think and announce and mind travel and say what he wished to. He wrote to his friend that he did not write to please, but to vex, and also that his travels are wonderful things and will wonderfully mend the world. Jonathan Swift is an ambiguous person, perhaps an ambivalent person, doubled in many ways. Was he English or was he Irish, for example?
Yes, so Jonathan Swift is in many ways a complex, shape-shifting figure. He's full of contradictions. One can seemingly say everything about him and his opposite. So this is a very intricate question that you ask. Swift was born in Dublin in 1667 to parents of English origin. His father died that same year, and when Swift was just a year old, he was taken by his wet nurse across the sea to Whitehaven in England and spent his earliest years separated from his mother. So then he was taken back to Dublin at the age of 3, apparently already able to read the Bible. But Swift would sometimes invert this origin myth of himself, claiming that he was born in England. And so he would maintain this ambivalence towards his Irishness his whole life. He studied logic and philosophy at Trinity College, Dublin, and in 1695 he was ordained as a Church of Ireland priest.
But he was also ambivalent about religion, wasn't he? Because he was caught between different quarrels, the Irish Catholics, the Quakers and the dissenters. He was a figure in the middle of a lot of strife in the church, in the Christian church.
Right, exactly. And he was often kind of plagued with rumors of possibly his own deep-seated atheism and his own beliefs. But Swift's fortunes were very much linked to the political turmoil of his age. So just to situate him a bit more, by the 1710s, Swift was living in London, and he found himself in the highest circles of power under the Tory regime. And he was already quite a celebrity for his scathing works of satire, such as Tale of the Tub, which in many ways took on religious ideas. And so Swift was culturally and politically conservative, but it was always tinged with iconoclasm. You know, he was demolishing his own convictions and beliefs at the same time as he held them. So it makes it often very hard to know where he stood on anything. And he also wrote under many disguises and pseudonyms, at least 41 of them, adding to the many masks that he wore.
Yes, and Gulliver's Travels was not published under his name. So it wasn't clear who had written it at the time it came out. It was soon known, but he disguised himself. It's usually read as satire, but I think one of the ways that Swift does belong in the fantastic genre is that you don't need to know the background. I mean, it's very helpful to hear it, but you don't need to know about the quarrels between the Whigs and the Tories or the terrible history of Ireland and England, tensions between these countries, to enjoy and to grasp what the targets of the travels are. I mean, do you think there is a way of thinking about it as fantasy rather than as political satire?
Yes, I think, it's so often read as satire, but focusing on it as a fiction of the fantastic really brings out something different. What is it to not read it just as a comment on its own contemporary social and political realities, but really as speculation or hypothesis of an alternative future? The question of what kind of worlds does Gulliver continue to open up for us as readers nearly 300 years later?
I think it also shows the way writing the fantastic is a way to liberate your own mind from the need to take a certain line. I mean, there's constant revolving points of view in Gulliver's Travels, and that in a way is what Swift himself is doing. He's trying every which way to look at a problem, and he doesn't have to be clear to us what his ultimate decision is. So this is why it's an endless food for thought, endless food for discussion. And that, I think, is the liberty of the fantastic for a writer like Swift. His targets are moving targets and they're constantly shifting. He attacks pretense and lying very, very thoroughly. And in the paratexts, which are many at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of Gulliver's Travels, he has many paratexts which tell you how truth this is, how somebody found the manuscript here, and so forth. And in that he protests that he is absolutely not lying, that lying is one of the terrible characteristics of the human race, and he has learned from the Houyhnhnms to be better. He says, "By the instructions and example of my illustrious master, I was able in the compass of 2 years, although I confess with the utmost difficulty, to remove that infernal habit of lying, shuffling, deceiving, and equivocating, so deeply rooted in the very souls of all my species, especially the Europeans." So he's there disavowing what he's actually doing, that he's creating a fictions and a series of, not exactly lies, but a series of fictions that will illuminate. And he does that all the way through the book, actually. He pretends that this is absolute fact, that he's learned veracity, that he's never going to deceive anybody.
In one of the early editions of Gulliver, there's a frontispiece of his portrait with the phrase "splendide mendax" beneath it, meaning nobly false. And then in other portraits of Gulliver, there was a resemblance to portraits of Swift himself. So there's this kind of uncertainty as to who is the author, what's true, what's false.
And also the wit and the humour of it, this self-mirroring, this endless evasiveness. He plays with us. But the mode of writing, because he was a tremendous champion of the English language and in a period when people were taking that very, very seriously. And he uses a scientific mode, doesn't he? He presents it as documentary, and he draws on a lot of scientific inventions or discoveries of the recent period. I mean, the microscope, for example, and the navigation aids like longitude, all these modern things at the time are applied to this fantastic voyage. So do you think that he wanted to show knowledge in the service of imagination, or do you think he was making fun of the scientific discoveries of the period?
I think, as we'll see as we travel between the islands, that he's very much doing both at the same time. The islands, each place that he washes up onto creates a kind of a blank slate or almost a field for a new game to be played, kind of each with its own set of rules of both the imagination and of empiricism kind of interwoven in a way that really no other writer does, to my mind. And many of the places that Gulliver arrives at are word plays on the names of the 2 cities that he called home, London and Dublin. So we voyaged to places like Lindolino and Glubdrubdrib and Bildendo and Langdon. But all of them are in some ways versions of Swift's homes, so much like Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, which we're going to talk about later in the series, are all versions of Venice.
Mm-hmm. Yes. But the first voyage, very famously, because it's much the most celebrated and much most loved, takes Gulliver to Lilliput. And you've pointed out, quite rightly, that the voyages to the New World that were then very much the rage and were being frequently and widely read, influenced the way Lilliput is evoked.
Yeah, so Swift stages a scene of first contact in Lilliput that in so many ways resembles kind of New World apotheosis myths, such as the arrival of Hernan Cortez among the Aztecs. The Lilliputians bring Gulliver lavish offerings of food. He can eat several of their roasted animals at once. And it's determined that his body exceeds the Lilliputian in the ratio of 12-1. So they calculate that he should be supplied with enough meat and drink for 1,728 Lilliputians per day. And so Gulliver records, "They supplied me as fast as they could, showing 1,000 marks of wonder and astonishment at my bulk and appetite. When I had performed these wonders, they shouted for joy and danced upon my breast, repeating several times as they did at first, 'Hekina de Ghoul.'" And this passage strikes me for a number of reasons. First, the appearance of wonder, which is such a trope in narratives of the discovery of the New World. It's such a kind of emotion deeply linked to imperialism. And also this word Hekina sounds so much like Shekinah in the Hebrew, which is the presence or literally the body of God. And Swift studied Hebrew at Trinity. So, whether or not Swift intended this, it's just one reading, but it does capture kind of Gulliver's godlike size to the Lilliputians. And so as the natives, the Lilliputians are kind of overawed and in wonder. They bear all sorts of similarities to the English. So their temple resembles Westminster Abbey. And so Swift kind of plays out this colonialism in reverse. And in a kind of brilliant satire of ethnography, the Lilliputians take a full inventory of the contents of Gulliver's pockets, which maybe I'll read from.
This is a very good example of how his shifting point of view, his ability to use fantasy to kind of give us a different perspective on reality, is used, because here we see from the Lilliputians' point of view what these miraculous and wonderful objects are.
Imprimis, in the right coat pocket of the great Man Mountain, for so I interpret the words quinbis flestrin, that's what the Lilliputians call Gulliver. After the strictest search, we found only one great piece of coarse cloth, large enough to be a footcloth for your Majesty's chief room of state. In the left pocket, we saw a huge silver chest with a cover of the same metal, which we, the searchers, were not able to lift. We desired it should be opened, and one of us, stepping into it, found himself up to the mid-leg in a sort of dust, some part whereof flying up to our faces, set us both a-sneezing for several times together. So that's Gulliver's handkerchief and his snuff box, but then things get especially interesting when they get to his pocket watch. He put this engine into our ears, which made an incessant noise, like that of a watermill, and we conjecture it is either some unknown animal or the god that he worships, but we are more inclined to the latter opinion, because he assured us, if we understood him right, for he expressed himself very imperfectly, that he seldom did anything without consulting it. He called it his oracle, and said it pointed out the time for every action of his life. So this idea of thinking that the watch as a god appears in Thomas Harriot's accounts of arriving among the Algonquins in the early English colony of Roanoke, and it's very similar to Harriot's account of kind of showing the Algonquins these gadgets like the watch. And Harriot writes that they thought they were rather the works of gods than men, or at least they have been given and taught of the gods. And then other moments in Gulliver's travels closely resemble European sailors' accounts of the arrival of Captain Cook on Hawaii, especially as we'll get into in Book 4, the natives there are very confused at having never seen clothes, so they think that they're part of Gulliver's body. And this is a mistake that appears in narratives of Captain Cook. But then again, Gulliver was written in the 1720s, And Cook didn't even arrive in Hawaii until 1779. So, Gulliver was inspired by these New World first contacts accounts, but possibly also the reverse is true, that the later ethnographies were inspired by Gulliver in turn.
I think that is another quality of the fantastic, that it plays back into reality, and it becomes very difficult to know what is real and what has been invented.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast, or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.